public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Election Innovation for Future Generations, and we are excited to be joined by some great panelists. Sherry Swenson has served as Salt Lake County Clerk since 1991. She has coordinated and established many successful programs to make voter participation more convenient for residents of Salt Lake County. She first promoted a permanent vote-by-mail program offering citizens the option of having a ballot mailed to them. Then, when the state law allowed, she implemented a vote-by-mail system so registered voters are automatically mailed a ballot for each election in which they're eligible to vote. Ricky Hatch is the county clerk for Weber County county clerk for Weber County, where he serves a population of over 260,000 people. He's a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Election Infrastructure Government Coordinating Council and served as the Election Officials Division Director for the International Association of Government Officials. He was honored as Utah's County Clerk of the Year in 2015 and the County Auditor of the Year in 2013 and 2017. Today's panel will be moderated by Stan Lockhart, the founder of the Lockhart Group. Stan is an experienced lobbyist in all levels of government. He has served as Provo City Council member, a former chair of the Utah Republican Party, and a member of the Utah State Board of Education. He has also been a lead advocate for ranked choice voting, hoping it may help reverse the trend of declining voter participation. And before I hand it over to Mr. Lockhart, we will have a short presentation by Aman Gruel of Utah Approves, so we can learn more about one potential election innovation, approval voting.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Aman Gruel. I am representing Utah Approves. It's a nonpartisan 501c4 here in the state. And today I'm talking about approval voting. So what is approval voting? It's simply that you can vote for all the candidates that you support, and the candidate with the most votes wins. It's really that simple. You can see a couple of sample ballots here on the left. You have our current system where you must select only one. And then on the right, you can see that the voter can select one or more candidates that they approve of or that they support. So some key differences with approval voting from our current system, simply that our current system elects based on exclusive support, while approval voting is much more based on favorability rating. It's much more like a job approval rating that you often see for the President of the United States or similar polls. Approval voting tends to favor a more broad-based candidates with a much more broad-based appeal, while our current system tends to favor candidates with a more passionate base of support. And finally, approval voting works really well with any number of candidates in a race, while our current system really only works well when there's two candidates in a race. Under our current system, if you have more than two candidates, the votes are split. And so voters that might normally support the positions of two candidates must choose only one, and so that voting base is split. But with approval, each candidate is assessed individually, independently by each voter. So one of the biggest benefits of approval voting is higher voter satisfaction. So since you can support any candidate that you like, winners tend to win with a much higher percentage. And that gives those winners a much stronger mandate to lead. Here on the left, you can see the 2020 Republican gubernatorial primary results, in which Spencer Cox won with about 36% of the vote. Now, was that really how much support he had among the Republican electorate? Would he have gotten much higher if people had been able to give him a job approval rating? So on the right, you can see an example approval voting election. This was the 2021 St. Louis mayoral primary. Again, a crowded race, 4 candidates, but they were allowed to select as many candidates as they wanted that they approved of. And you see that the winner won with 57% of the vote, a much stronger winning mandate. Even the third place finisher had more support than Governor Cox in our choose only one plurality system. So here's a quick simulation that was done by Warren D. Smith, a Princeton mathematician in 2000. And this is measuring the voter satisfaction results from various different voting methods. You can see along the right, the y-axis is measuring simplicity. So voting methods higher in the graph are simple, and voting methods lower are a little bit more complex. And along the x-axis along the bottom, we're seeing different levels of voter satisfaction. And this satisfaction is really just like a utilitarian measure of how happy the broad electorate is with the winner. In the case of a winner in a crowded plurality election, maybe that winner only won with 20% of the vote. That means 80% of people voted for someone else. So that electorate would tend to be less satisfied with that result. So one thing I want to point out, first of all, this is with 5 candidates in the race. Again, if you only have 2 candidates in a race, it really doesn't matter what voting method you use. So this is really a discussion about different voting methods with a crowded race, 3 or more candidates. So thousands of simulations were run on different voting scenarios, with voters being more or less honest in their preferences. And you can see here, in the middle of the graph is our current system, plurality. So it's pretty high in the graph, so it's a very simple system, but it's pretty far to the left in the graph in that it has fairly low voter satisfaction for those same reasons: spoiled elections, winners with only 20% support, that type of thing. Okay. Next, you can see instant runoff voting, which is another term for ranked choice voting, which we'll talk about later today, in which 23 cities in Utah piloted just this past year. You can see that in the best case scenario, it actually has a much higher voter satisfaction than with our current system. And so it has the potential to be much better. But in the worst case scenario, it isn't much better in some voting scenarios. But still a significant improvement over our current system. And then finally, you have approval voting, which is actually even simpler than our current system. It's basically just removing the rule that you can't vote for more than one. It's even harder to mess up your ballot because you can just vote for as many as you like. And so it rates really well with simplicity, and with this measure in this simulation, it rates very well with voter satisfaction. So where has approval voting actually been used? So very similar systems have been used internationally for papal conclaves. It was used for a long time in Venice, Italy, in the Greek legislature, and currently used for the UN General Secretary selection process. Most recently, it was implemented in a couple cities here in the United States, Fargo, North Dakota, and St. Louis, Missouri. And here on the right, you can see some polling feedback from voters who used approval voting, how they liked it. You can see by wide margins, they thought the instructions were clear, they liked it was easy to understand, they were comfortable with approval, they liked its increased expressivity, and they wanted to expand its use. And you can see the liked approval there, and you can see that it's a 3-to-1 margin of people liking it over disliking it. So that's a strong mandate for voters appreciating this system. So this is a quick summary of comparisons between our different voting methods. I'd love to dive into each of these in a lot more detail, but I'll just go over a high-level overview of each of these. First of all, a high winning percentage. Under our current system, if you have a crowded race, the winner, they have to have a low winning percentage because it's spread between so many candidates. Whereas under approval and ranked choice, you tend to have much higher winning mandates, a winner with much higher percentage. Next, expressive ballot. That means a voter can really provide a more expressive opinion in their voting instead of just choosing only one. So obviously our current system is not very expressive, while approval and ranked choice voting are much more expressive. Next, whether it works well with 3+ candidates. So our current system does not work well with a crowded race. That vote is split so many different ways, but approval and ranked choice both do very well with crowded races. Next, voter satisfaction. Again, our current system is very low on that measure. Approval is relatively high, and ranked choice is fairly moderate, depending on the race. Next, ballot spoilage. Ballot spoilage is a huge issue that's often ignored. It's the idea that voters, by a mistake or something, they mess up their ballot. And the county clerks, when they're looking at the ballot, they can't quite determine what the voter meant, or maybe the voter just didn't fill it out properly. So under our current system, it's about 2%, give or take. That's still significant if you have millions of voters, but it's still fairly low. With approval voting, that almost goes away. It's really hard to mess up an approval voting ballot, just because the main reason that our current system is often spoiled is because you maybe mark 2, but you're only allowed 1. Unfortunately, ranked choice voting has a little bit higher ballot spoilage rates just because of the greater complexity of ranking your choices on your ballot. Next, new voting software. Again, no changes needed under our current system. Also, no changes needed for approval voting. All the voting machines and all the software that we currently use work for that. Whereas, like we saw here in Utah, some changes were needed to be made to voting software and to some voting hardware as well. Next, ballot size. Ballot size seems like a trivial issue. With our current system, obviously, it's fairly small. With approval voting, the ballot size does not change at all. But with ranked choice, the ballot does tend to balloon significantly, especially if you have a lot of races using ranked choice voting. And there's some concern that if our ballot gets too large, we wouldn't be able to continue our mail-in voting just because it would be cost prohibitive. Next, counting complexity. Obviously, counting is very simple under our current system. You just tally up the votes for each candidate. Same with approval voting. It's a little bit more complex and harder for a lot of voters to understand how that's tabulated under ranked choice voting. Precinct summable, that just means that the actual tabulation, the actual counting of the voting happens at a local level, at the precinct, at the county level, and doesn't need to be all centrally accumulated and tabulated in one central location. That's the case for our current system and approval as well, but ranked choice voting needs to be consolidated and centrally tabulated. And finally, voter education. Obviously, not much needs to be done to explain how to vote for our current system. There is some definite voter education to help voters know how to use approval voting, just to allow them to take full advantage of it, and then also the same for ranked choice voting. So that's a quick summary of the comparison between these different systems. I'm really excited for increased dialogue. In case you aren't familiar, these different voting systems are under debate by the Utah legislature. Debating about whether to let cities use them and potentially use these voting methods for all elections statewide. With that, if you're interested in supporting the approval voting and contacting your legislators about that, you can scan this QR code and it'll give you the opportunity to send a letter to your current representative. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Ammon. My name is Stan Lockhart, and I'm a director at Utah Ranked Choice Voting. And it's kind of interesting, there are several directors at Utah Ranked Choice Voting, but somehow, most of the time, I become the central focus of Ranked Choice Voting's efforts in the state of Utah. And I finally have concluded that I'm fine with that. So if you want to call somebody, talk to someone who likes Ranked Choice Voting, you can give me a call. So I'm going to take about 45 minutes to rebut everything that Ammon said. I'm just joking. But the purpose of me being here today is to moderate a discussion about different methods of elections. Here's what I want you to come away with today. The traditional system of plurality voting is fraught with challenges. And just because we're used to using it does not mean it is the best way to choose elected officials. And so I want you to open your minds today to alternatives. There is a famous theorem called Arrow's theorem. And this professor got some sort of an award for coming up with this theorem. Now, I freely confess, as I confessed to my colleagues up here before the meeting, that when I read it, it's hard to understand. But the end result is there is no perfect method of elections. There are only relative strengths and weaknesses. And you have to look at each election to determine the best way of electing them. Does that make sense to you? So if you have an election, the goal is to find someone who will represent the people who are voting for them. And there are more and less artful ways of doing so, ways that produce greater certainty that you will get the person that has the majority of support. So I think what we'll do today, though, is we turn to a discussion. Let's start talking a little bit about elections in Utah. I mean, we have, we've introduced the people up here, but let me just say this. Sherry Swenson and Ricky Hatch may be the two most experienced people in elections in the entire state. You are lucky to have them today. Now, we don't always agree. Surprise, surprise. but many times we do. And they have a task where there's a whole bunch of processes in order to conduct an election. And they know each one of those processes backwards and forwards and up and down. And Ammon, I've just met Ammon today. I don't know him very well, but I'm sure he's a great guy too. So, long and short is, let's talk a little bit about the challenges with plurality elections. And I think, Sherry and Ricky, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general you like plurality elections. I don't think you have a huge beef with them. But why do we use them? And why is it good for voters to have plurality elections? Sherry?
My job as an administrator of elections is to try to give people the option to vote and to make it as simple and transparent and accessible as it can be.
Right.
And so with that, with the introduction of ranked choice voting, and it was something that the municipalities had an option because I allowed them to have an option.
Yeah.
With the change in the law. And we do contracts, by the way, for the municipalities. We contracted with 18 cities, 5 metro townships, and 6 local service districts to conduct their elections. It isn't my statutory responsibility as county clerk to do the municipal elections, which are done in the odd-numbered years. So I gave the municipalities the option to select ranked choice voting to conduct their elections, and 9 of them did. And so we had to implement ranked choice voting to allow them to conduct the elections in the way they wanted them conducted. And from my perspective as an administrator, it was very challenging for us. So it isn't that I'm defending plurality voting, it was just from an administrative standpoint, it was very challenging for us to administer ranked choice voting. From the beginning of laying out the ballot so it made sense, creating instructions that made sense to people, having to configure a ballot. And I'll give you an example. Sandy Mayor's race had 8 candidates. And with 8 candidates running for mayor, that ballot, it takes up a large amount of space. And all the candidates were listed vertically, and then the choices were across the top of the ballot. First choice, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. Utah's law doesn't allow you to only select 4 choices or 3 choices or 5 choices, as some other jurisdictions limit the number of choices. So the mayor race in Sandy took almost the entire page of the ballot with the instructions at the top. So it was challenging because then we were trying to also lay out 72 different ballot faces depending on where you live in the county, with the standard elections on some of the races, the local districts, the council races. And so it was very challenging for me as an administrator to implement this system. I had people calling my office when they received their ballot, and they were angry. They thought I woke up one morning and decided to make ranked choice voting an option on their ballot, and we were explaining to them that it was something that the city council decided to implement, and many of them I heard from with emails, phone calls, that they were tearing up their ballot, they weren't going to vote it, that they hadn't had enough notice from their city councils. And of course, we normally hear from people that are angry. We don't often hear from the people that are happy. So from that perspective, it was about the challenges that we had. It took us, with our team, about 2 weeks to even get the ballots laid out. And we didn't realize the difficulty of trying to lay out just the ballot formatting so that these would lay out in a way that people would understand it. You couldn't put a ranked choice contest and then a standard contest right next to it. It looked terrible. My staff would bring me one of those versions and I'd say, oh no, that isn't going to work. People are going to be so confused. If they have one on this column and another one on this column, they're not going to understand it. So we went through many, many iterations. But having said that, when it was all done and we went through making sure that our instructions were very explicit, that they had examples of how to do it right, showing graphs or examples of how to do it right, how you didn't do it. I think it turned out well. That, along with the city recorders, who did a lot of voter education, it actually turned out better than I had expected it would.
That visualizer was fantastic.
And some of the jurisdictions that implemented ranked choice voting said, rank your candidates between 1 and 4. I do not think that was the way it should have been done, and I can't even imagine how confusing that was to voters versus our explicit instructions.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, from an administrative perspective, I thought that it was kind of put on us a little bit quickly. I thought there should have been more lead time. So it isn't that I'm so much an advocate for plurality voting. I think it needed to come on with more time, more education, and that people would be more educated in the process. And then also us being able to learn more about the implementation. We definitely undercharged the municipalities for which we did the contracts. But nevertheless, you know, fewer ballots were adjudicated than we expected would be, because we thought that was going to be a big problem. But when we talk about space on ballot, adding those contests to more elections, I envision if we did it in a general election, we would have between a 3 to 5 page ballot, which would be very cost prohibitive in a general election.
Yeah. So for the first time, it was challenging, but it'll be easier in subsequent times, wouldn't you say?
I think it would be somewhat easier. I think we'd still have the challenges with our current law where there's not a limit to the number of choices a voter can make. I'm not sure why, you know, you were more involved in the creation of the law, why in other jurisdictions they have 3 choices or 5,
Yeah.
why ours was open-ended, I don't know.
So plurality voting causes people to be really happy or really unhappy. That's what we have in plurality voting.
It encourages
And with
extremism. Yeah.
it encourage I call it polarization.
Yes.
Right? In these alternative methods, you get less strong happy and strong unhappy, and more the spectrum of happiness. Right? So if one of your backup votes wins in ranked choice voting, you're kind of happy. Whereas in plurality voting, your guy either wins or your gal wins or they don't win. And so you've got this incredible unhappiness. And so you've got to, as you look at kind of what's happening in politics in America, one of the advantages of having an alternate method of voting is that you theoretically, you get more civility in your races. You get more issues-oriented campaigning instead of the politics of personal destruction. You get more discussion about the future of the jurisdiction on the issues that are there. Whereas there's this incentive to go in and go nuclear on your opponent when it's a plurality election and you're trying to just straight up beat them, right? And so candidates are nicer to each other. Now I will tell you, they're not always nice. It's a relative spectrum, but they're nicer. New York City is a great example. I don't know how many people have taken a taxi in New York City, but to say that those people are nice might be a slight overstatement. And so those candidates did go after each other a little bit. But if you talk to people that have seen many, many elections in New York City, so New York City used ranked choice voting in their primary last year, the largest implementation of ranked choice voting in the history of the country. And it produced the person that if you had said before the election began, who do I think is going to win this race? The person who won is the person that you thought would win, Eric Adams. But he didn't win by a lot. And in the final round, he still barely held off a challenger. But the long story short is, it worked very, very well. And as much as they kind of sniped at each other a little bit during the election, those that are long-term watchers said it wasn't near as bad as it was in the past. So on a relative scale, there is less contention amongst the candidates. And we call it, they're more civil to each other. Some other benefits of these alternative methods, it's not just reserved for ranked choice voting, it's probably approval voting as well. I don't know much about approval voting, but it causes, the real issue here, when our founders created our country, the most important thing that came out of this representative form of government was an election. In fact, whenever we talk about what our most important responsibilities as citizens are, the single most important responsibility we have is to go vote in order that our opinion can count and that we can have a part in this representative form of government, because what happens in those voting booths really does affect the way that we're governed as a country. And so our founders knew that. Our founders stayed away from a pure democracy. They didn't think that was a good idea. And they certainly stayed away from a king and royalty and a dictatorship. They didn't want anything to do with that. So they created this unique American experiment, and it really is a representative republic. That's what they created. Some people call it a representative democracy, which is the same basic principle, that we go to the polls and we elect people who represent us. So it becomes incredibly important what happens in that voting booth. That matters. And figuring out a way to get people elected who best represent the people who elect them becomes really, really important. So we started off with plurality voting and just somehow over time have just stayed with it. I've heard a lot of people give reasons why they think we stayed with it, but there is some evidence that we have a two-party system in part because of plurality voting. Because our founders didn't really envision a two-party system. They thought it would end up being something much more like what they have in Europe in terms of multi-parties and coalitions and things like that. But we ended up with the two-party system. And by the way, I'm a party person. I'm a former chairman of the Republican Party. I don't want to get rid of parties. And some people in some of these alternative movements, some of the goal is we want to get rid of parties. Well, I'm not there. But I think we can use alternative forms of election and still give parties their role in holding up a banner and having people flock to that banner. So that's why we're having this discussion today, you guys, because this election, this thing that happens when you fill out your ballot. Today we have vote by mail, so it comes in the mail. When you fill out that ballot, that is incredibly important, that you're able to select your leaders. And how do you do that? Well, you give your opinion, and then everybody else's opinion, everybody else's vote gets counted, and sometimes we're happy and sometimes we're unhappy. And I'd suggest that it's a lot better to be somewhat happy than to be either happy or unhappy. And that's what you get when you start looking at these alternatives. Ricky, what are some of your thoughts on plurality voting and these alternatives and just where we're going with this whole entire stuff?
You bet. And I want to underscore a point that Stan made, talking about you're either very unhappy or very happy. There was a study done by MIT on voter confidence after certain elections, and they found a 20-point swing on whether your party's candidate was elected president or not. That affected your confidence in the election by 20 percentage points. That's massive. So we had, clearly we know what happened in 2020 and a lot of the concern over the losing party for the presidential race. In 2016, we had the exact same thing. It was just the other party. And there were protests, and there were "not my president" hashtags flying around. And so that, Stan is right on when it comes to that plurality voting really does encourage or result in I'm either really unhappy or I'm really happy. And it's kind of that kind of dichotomy that's a challenge. Now, putting on my election administrator hat, as election administrators, we have some really fundamental key priorities. First is we follow the law. We have to make sure that everything that we do is in accordance with legal requirements that are set out by the state as well as the federal government. Secondly, we want to make sure that the election is counted, that the results are tabulated accurately, and that the election is secure. That's crucial. Without that, why have elections? And so we go to painstaking levels of detail to make sure that that happens. Thirdly is we want to remove barriers. And that can be barriers as far as tests, literacy tests that used to be required, poll taxes, things like that. Those are more or less a thing of the past, but there are other barriers, and one of the barriers is complexity. Complexity of the instructions, complexity of the voting process, complexity of the voting method. And I think this is one of the big reasons why plurality has remained where it is today, is because it is a very simple system for voters to understand. They're familiar with it, they're comfortable with it. Now, anytime you're dealing with hundreds of thousands or even millions of voters, sometimes a little small, tiny change can create huge issues. And it's not that voters are stupid, but you have this large range of voters who have their own lives, and some of them might be going through really horrific challenges in their personal lives that impact their ability to cognitively fully understand things. And some of them might just be distracted when they go to vote. And we see it, we saw it in 2016 in Texas. They showed a video of someone voting for Hillary, and it just kept shifting back and voting for Trump, or maybe it was vice versa, and they said, see, it's broken. Well, when in fact what they were doing is you have to deselect a candidate and then select the other one. So, but that went viral, and it was like the elections are rigged and Dominion voting is all for the Democrats, and it was really based off of a voter misunderstanding, but then it was captured and then just amplified across by partisan attack. And so it's these small changes that really can make a huge difference. And that's why as election officials, when we hear of these other voting methodologies, we really have to think of them not so much from a policy standpoint, does this make good sense? Because that's more or less the legislature duties. Now, we're elected as well, and so we have some responsibility there also, but we really have to think, how does this impact the voters? Is this going to increase kind of confusion among voters, among candidates, and not just on the voting process, but on the reporting of the results? And I think, so it's a long way of getting to your question, but I think that's part of the reason why the clerks were pretty hesitant to make changes, because we realize the impact that can have on some of the voters.
Could I add one thing to
Sure,
that?
sure.
I was trying to understand, especially in a jurisdiction, even if it's in a smaller area where they had not as many choices. I was trying to wrap my head around how it's a level playing field. For example, if you have, as we did, quite a number of voters, and especially where they said, well, I'm just going to pick one because I don't get this. And then you had other voters picking 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 in the case of the Sandy mayor. I'm trying to understand how that's a level playing field. I'm not sure I can realize that it is. Maybe they have the same chance to pick as many, but is that a level playing field? That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around when you've got so many people picking different numbers. I'm not sure that, and many of them, especially we heard from elderly people that would say, well, I don't get it. I'm just going to pick one then.
So here's the key to it, Sherry, and it's really kind of a pivot in the way you see this, because I've had this discussion with others. The pivot is this: it's about voter will, and the voter gets to choose, and they get to fully express their will, however great or limited that might be. And so all the emphasis in these alternative methods is on the voter and what the voter would prefer. And if the voter only wants to vote for one, then that is the fullest expression of their will that they're willing to do at the time. But the voter that votes for 5 when there's 6 candidates, or ranks all 6 or whatever, then that's a full expression of that voter's will. So it comes down to so to your question, you've got to focus on each individual voter being allowed to fully express their will at the polls. And whether it's approval voting and they vote for one, or they vote for all of them, or whether it's ranked choice voting and there are 5 candidates and they vote for all 5 or only vote for 1 or 2 or 3, it is their full expression of their will. And that's powerful. The more we can empower voters at the polls to fully express their will. Let me tell you to your point, let me tell you some of the games with with plurality voting. Here are some of the games that are played. So in some jurisdictions, this is called the spoiler effect. If it's a conservative district and a Republican and a Democrat are running, the Republican or the Democrat will go find a libertarian to run so they can siphon off votes and get elected. Or in a blue state, in a liberal state, the conservative will go out and find the Green Party candidate to run so they can siphon votes off the Democrat. And that happens all the time. It doesn't happen in our state quite as much, but it does happen. In fact, Florida has some great examples of that happening, where literally strategically as a candidate, if you can go out and play enough games, just by getting other candidates in the race, you can end up winning.
Yeah.
Right? And that's...
We have to remember there's a metagame. The structure of the voting system affects the way that parties strategically act. It's a way to change the way that media companies act. The entire system goes in this cycle where the kind of gate of everyone's behavior is the thing that determines who holds power. So yeah, a system with plurality voting is going to tend to cycle into a two-party system where that's further entrenched.
Another good example is, let's say that you have 3 candidates running in a conservative district. 2 of those candidates are conservatives, 1 of them is liberal. The conservative candidates can split the vote, each get 30%, the liberal gets 40%, and suddenly you have the liberal representing a conservative district. And that's called splitting the vote. And that's very common in plurality elections. Another thing that happens in plurality elections is you'll find, this is what happened in the 2016 presidential primary or presidential election in Utah, in the general election. We had Hillary Clinton, we had Donald Trump. We had this guy named Evan McMullin come to town and say, choose me, I'm a better candidate than either, and I better represent you. And immediately his poll number started going up. When they got to approximately 20 to 25%, the Trump campaign came up with a new motto. They said, a vote for McMullin is a vote for Hillary. And immediately McMullin's poll numbers evened out and started coming down. So think in the voter's mind, gee, I kind of like this guy, but wait a second, and again, Utah being generally conservative, but wait a second, I really don't want Hillary. So maybe I've got to vote for Trump, who I really don't like as much. It's the games, it's the strategic voting that drives me crazy with plurality voting. You have to be strategic. You can't just vote for the person you want the most. You've got to vote for the person that, wait a second, who's most acceptable that I can vote out of all these candidates that has a great chance of getting elected? I'll give you another example. In the 2020 Republican primary for governor, there were 4 candidates on the ballot. Theoretically, a candidate with 26% of the vote might have won that election. As it happened, a candidate with 36% of the vote won the election. And that leads us into a whole different discussion about at what level of support amongst the voters should a candidate have to get elected. It used to be you had to have a majority in this country to get elected to office. But over time, that's kind of gone away, and I don't think the public believes it's 50% anymore. But at 36%, or in the 1st congressional district, 30% of the vote won the nomination for the Republican candidate. Is that really a mandate on the part of Republicans on who they want? So out of the 4 candidates running for governor, we had Spencer Cox, John Huntsman, Greg Hughes, Thomas Wright. Huntsman got 36%, or Cox got 36%, Huntsman got 35%, and then the other 2 got. Well, I was talking to Greg Hughes, one of the candidates, right after the race. And I said, Greg, what happened? He said, Stan, I was running polling every day. I spent a ton of money on polling every single day. And up until election day, I was running neck and neck with Huntsman and Cox. And on election day, I got creamed. And I thought, man, I spent all this money on polling. What in the world happened? So he took the time and the money, and he did a poll after the election, and he asked people who had already said to him, See, in these polls, they actually keep track of who you are when you say you're going to vote for someone. So he went back to the people that said they were going to vote for Hughes, and he said, "Why didn't you vote for me?" And here's what they said. The Salt Lake Tribune polling said it was between Huntsman and Cox. I liked you best, Greg, but I had to vote for one of those two so my vote would count. That's the problem with plurality voting. That is the problem. You can't vote for the person you want the most. You got to think strategically. Who has the best shot at getting elected that I like the most? And it's just harder that way. In ranked choice voting, I'm telling you, you get to vote for the person you want the most. And then you get a backup. In case that person goes out early, you get a backup. Now I get to choose the person I like the second most and the third most, and those are all backups in case your person goes out before the last round. In approval voting, you get a chance to vote for more with the idea that hopefully the people that you like the most will rise up in those elections and get elected. But it's all this strategic voting that I find problematic with plurality voting. And it's the fact that you literally have to teach people these mathematic games in their heads in order to teach them how to vote in America. I'd rather have people be able to say, I really like that person. I like George Zinn the most. I want George Zinn as my first choice. But nobody else is going to vote for him. So who's my second choice? And so on, so that I can be there in the final round and that I can make a difference. I might not be as happy if George doesn't get elected, but I'll be somewhat happy. I'll be happier than if I lose.
I would.
We've got our own challenges. If we get into this too much, George, we're going to have our own challenges. Okay, so let's keep going on here. So let's, I think to give you guys the tapestry of where we're at in this state, for all of Utah's conservative reputation, we're a remarkably pragmatic state. Now, I'm pretty sure students at the University of Utah may not believe that. But our legislature and our governor work together hard to pioneer and pilot new things. They do it in all aspects of our lives. It doesn't matter whether it is in our criminal system, it doesn't matter whether it's in our healthcare system, our education system. They are always trying new things. That's why we have a legislative session every year, frankly, is because they want to try new things. One of the things that they have authorized in the last 5 years is a pilot with ranked choice voting. They thought it had enough merit. A conservative activist brought it to the Republican Party in the late 1990s. Somewhere in the early 2000s, it came through the Democratic Party. And so it really started in the parties, and we started using it at our conventions, and we started using it in our caucuses. And then these same grassroots activists went to the legislature and said, please run a bill to do ranked choice voting in our public elections. And Ricky and his clerks kept fighting it and keeping it in rules over and over again. At the time, it may not have even been Ricky, but it was his clerks that did it, and Sherry's clerks, and they said, no, we don't want to see any change. We hate change. Okay, that might be a slight exaggeration.
I have a comment. We didn't have a system that would accommodate ranked choice voting. We couldn't run ranked choice voting.
See, I knew there was a rebuttal. I knew there was a response to it.
We couldn't have even formatted a ballot. We couldn't have tabulated a ballot. So until we got our new system, quite honestly.
So it stayed in rules for years. And then in 2017, one of the most conservative legislators and one of the most liberal legislators co-sponsored a bill and to do ranked choice voting in all elections in this state, and it passed the House 55-17. And this overwhelming support went over to the Senate, and the Senate's like, what in the world are you guys doing over there? Which the Senate does an awful lot. The Senate is the deliberate body, the House is the voice of the people and a little more rowdy. So it got to committee, and it failed on a 3-3 vote in committee to go forward. So about that time, I got involved, and I started going and talking to senators. And I said, why won't you vote for ranked choice voting? Well, we don't know how Utah voters are going to respond to it. We can see what's going on around the country. There's been over 500 public elections in the last 10 or 15 years with ranked choice voting. And we see around the country that people really like it once they use it. Until you use these alternate methods, everyone's skeptical, right? We're used to plurality voting. We're used to circling one candidate. We're not really sure if we're going to like this other. And by the way, we know those games in plurality voting. We know how to game the system. Well, I'm not sure I know how to game this other system, even if there's no games. So until they use it, they're very skeptical. And once they use these alternative methods, they like them because they're better. And again, a voter gets to more fully express their will. So, so after talking to senators, all 29 senators over the course of a summer, they agreed that we would do it. To use ranked choice voting. But there was one small problem. Over about a 20-year period, in fact, Sherry led the charge on this in an effort to help run more efficient elections and be more cost effective. The counties had taken over the administration of city elections. And cities were no longer, statutorily they were in charge of their elections, but functionally they were not. And so they came to us and said, we all want to run ranked choice voting elections, but we've got to go to our county to do it. So we tripped on over to the counties and said, counties, how would you like to run ranked choice voting elections? Well, there was a resist movement in this country in 2020, and in this state, the resist movement wasn't against Donald Trump. It actually was against ranked choice voting on the part of county clerks, because 28 of 29 said, absolutely not, we are not doing ranked choice voting. But one county clerk said yes. She was brand new. She was naive. She had never run an election before. She had just gotten elected, and she's like, yeah, I've been doing this in the Republican Party ever since I've been a delegate. Of course I'll try it out. And 2 cities signed up, Payson and Vineyard. And those 2 cities had a wonderful, wonderful ranked choice voting experience. At the end of that election, after the election polling, 82% not only liked it, they wanted to do it again. And those 2 cities re-upped this year in 2021. So we had great results in 2019. In 2020, we had this election where there are some who question the integrity of the election. And by the way, I will tell you that Utah clerks run great elections. There is not rampant fraud in our elections. And I hope I'm on TV, that I can say that publicly. These clerks do a great job. And every time we do audits, and it's all auditable, but every time we go out and do audits, we do find a little bit of fraud. There's a handful. It's like, like when I'm talking handfuls, I'm talking fingers on hands. And it almost always is mothers of LDS missionaries who vote for their kids. That's where our fraud comes from. Okay, so we do not have widespread voter fraud in this state at all. They run great elections in our state. How's that for an endorsement, you guys, of what our county clerks do? So anyway, we get into 2021. Well, we had a little bill in the legislature that helps us get there. But long story short, we found 4 county clerks, including Sherry, that were willing to run ranked choice voting last year. And we had 23 cities sign up. In 3 of those cities, they didn't have enough candidates to use it. So it got used in 20 cities. 40% of Utah voters were able to use it last year. So our largest city, Salt Lake City, used it. Sandy, our second largest city, used it. We had Lehigh and Draper, some really large cities in our state using ranked choice voting. And it's a pilot. We were hoping that 6 or 7 would use it. We were unprepared for 23. And so, really, to the point of our clerks, what they're saying is, we really don't want to do widespread changes to elections because it's hard to educate large numbers of people at any one time. The goal has always been to do these incrementally. 2 cities, 5 to 10,000 voters, yeah, we can do that. But a couple 100,000 voters, that was much more difficult, and Sherry pulled it off without a hitch. And so did Utah County. They had a large number. And Cache County did it, and Wasatch County did it. And they all did it very, very well. Now, we had a few glitches. So we're running a cleanup bill this year in the legislature to fix some of those glitches. It's a pilot. It's not designed to be widespread. But every time we use it, and every time we see the voter results, the polling was the same this time around as it was in Payson and Vineyard. Before the election, voters were pretty skeptical. After the election, overwhelming majorities liked their ranked choice voting experience. Now, we had one city where we had a real surprise. That is Sandy. By the way, I know we weren't going to have this all on ranked choice voting, but I think it's important you know where we're at so that we can know where we're going. right? You need to know where we're at today.
You are the mediator, though.
Yeah.
Stay neutral.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see I'm totally neutral in all this, you guys. Support ranked choice voting. So in Sandy's election, you had a moderate to liberal Democrat win in a fairly conservative city. And you say, how did that happen? Well, I'm going to tell you the secret today of how it happened. And this is based on us diving into election results. Here's what happened. Number one, there was organized opposition and an organized disinformation campaign. And some people really were intent on persuading Sandy voters to only vote for one, even though they used ranked choice voting. So a good chunk of conservative voters in that city did not fully express their will. Or maybe I should say they fully expressed their will based on misinformation. So that's the first thing that happened. The winner, by the way, only won by 21 votes. Okay? The second thing that happened is that in these alternate methods of election, whether it's approval voting or ranked choice voting, there are different strategies for candidates. So in a plurality election, you go to your base, and then you expand from your base. In ranked choice voting, you go to all voters and you make your case, and you figure out what issues all these voters in different places care about, and then you lean in. Same with approval voting. You're trying to get people to check the box, so you've got to expand past your base in order to do that. And so the winning candidate did exactly that. One great example is up on the East Bench. There are a whole bunch of Republican voters, and they hate the gondola going up the canyon. And this candidate came out early and said, I'm against the gondola, even though the mayor's office has nothing to do with it. She got a ton of votes up in that district because she leaned into their issue. That's the key in some of these things. So anyways, a different strategy. But by doing that, she was able to peel off enough conservative voters to end up winning. Now, the two in the final round in that race were the same two who were leading in the first round. And one of the great things about these alternative methods is that the outcomes aren't that much different than plurality voting. It's just a lot fewer games are played when you do it. So today, here's what's happening in the state with these alternative methods. Plurality voting is still the standard. Make no mistake, it's still what's taking place all over. We're still working on the pilot. The pilot is good until 2028 with ranked choice voting. The approval voting folks would like to become a part of the pilot, but so far they have not had a lot of success in persuading legislators to get into the pilot. But I think it's just a matter of time until we start exploring some of these other things. And the key is to do it incrementally so that we can measure what the effects are in these elections. And as long as the elections have outcomes where the majority choose their winners, then we should be pretty happy with the fact that we're finding some new ways to do things. So that's the update. So let's pivot back. We've got another 5 minutes. Sherry, give some commentary on this, where we're at today stuff.
So where we're at today, are you talking about ranked choice voting?
Well, it could be, plurality voting is still the standard, right? These alternative methods are growing, but they're still...
Some of the cities wanted to see how it turned out in the other cities.
Yeah.
Like I said, we contracted with 18. 9 of them chose, actually 10 of them chose, and Riverton was one, and they didn't have a contested race in their entire city. And so the contentious one obviously was Sandy City. And then after the race was that close, they wanted to recount. The law that was written for the pilot project did not allow us to do a recount.
We're changing that law this year.
Yes. It stripped out all of the methods that we normally use to do a recount, rerunning the ballots, and who can request it, and when they can request it out of the statute. And so we were kind of at a loss as to even be able to do a recount to prove that close result of 21 vote difference. So it was very contentious. The city council wasn't going to certify the election. That was painful, can I just say? Not the best experience for us to have as running an election for a ranked choice election for a large city like Sandy. But they ended up certifying the election, and that was good to get through, but it was painful. And As far as other cities, I don't know how they'll feel about it. I know Sandy's doing their own polling to see whether they would even consider doing it again. I know the Lieutenant Governor's office is doing a poll to see whether and how people felt about it.
Have you
Maybe
seen
you've
the Y2
explained-
analytics poll?
Yeah, maybe you've explained why some and many people only did one choice in Sandy. I don't know
Yeah,
how
I
that
think,
arrived.
I think it was the disinformation campaign.
One thing that I did note, and I think it's problematic when you apply it to a multi-winner contest, and we saw this, and for example, I've got some data on Bluffdale Council at Large. They're electing 2 people in their council at large, and so is Draper Council at Large. One thing we saw, large numbers of overvotes because people just don't get it. They're voting for 2 people, to elect 2 people. And so they're supposed to vote for a first choice, a second choice, and so on. They were overvoting or selecting 2 people for their first choice. And so we saw a large number of overvotes which canceled that choice. So for example, in the Bluffdale at large, 93 overvotes for first choice. Draper, 164 overvotes. Now you compare that to a Cottonwood Heights Council district where we saw 1 overvote. Mill Creek, 4 overvotes. Mill Creek Council 4, 7 overvotes. Huge number of overvotes. So that's kind of problematic when they're applying it to a multi-winner contest where they're selecting 2 council members. I don't know how that can be fixed, but it was a problem applying ranked choice to a multi-winner contest.
Okay, thank you. Ricky, just
I'll give you-
whatever's on your mind.
I'll give you a 30-second. Right now, voter confidence across the country is low. And Stan was right when he said, in Utah, we do things very well. We are extremely careful with every single vote. And you can have absolute confidence in how votes are counted and reported here in Utah. The one thing that every election official, we are just super concerned about the voter concerns and about ensuring that we can fully stand behind our counting process and our results. Under the current system, I am totally confident that it works through a certified system and it's exactly the result that was the intent of the voters. With ranked choice voting, I'm not so sure. I need to look at it more. There are complications on the back end, especially if you move into a statewide race, some significant complications. Complications can be overcome, but is now the right time to make that kind of change with the current voter confidence environment and the current needs for our elections. It's great in concept, but let's take a look at things from a holistic election administration process.
Okay, Ammon.
Thank you. I'll be really quick as well. I think in our country, we're so polarized, we're so divided, and the only way we're going to get out of that is to get to a multi-party, healthy system. And that's what most other Western democracies across the world have, and that's what we can have if we can just change how we vote. And I think a couple of these methods are really promising, and I'd love to gather more data, and I'd love for all of you to get engaged in this effort to innovate here in Utah, what we do best. That's all.
Good. Okay, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Yes, from the back. First of all, why are you dressed in a suit?
Yeah, I just like to be official.
Okay.
My question is for the county clerks. You guys mentioned that 28 out of 29 county clerks were opposing ranked choice voting when it was first being discussed being implemented here in the state. Currently, as you mentioned, approval voting is being discussed in the legislature to pilot the pilot program. And there's been some news lately that all 29 county clerks in the state have been supportive of using approval voting as the best alternative option. Sherry, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that ranked choice voting is really difficult to implement and complicated to administer as an election method. Do you think that approval voting would be easier and why?
Approval voting would not take up nearly the space on a ballot. I have to say it's much like the space on a ballot would not be nearly as large. It's much like when we have a contest for at-large candidates. So it doesn't take up the real estate on a ballot. What's hard to envision from people that are not laying out ballots, and especially with the vote by mail system, is the space on a ballot for a vote by mail system is very valuable. And when you start getting into multiple page ballots, for example, if we go to a 2-card ballot in Salt Lake County, it would cost us over $200,000 to implement just one extra page. If you start taking additional extra pages, and it's not just postage, it's printing, it's the administrative part of scanning them, it's people having to send back one page with their signature on their return envelope, and then maybe forgetting to send another page and sending it separately. There's just all kinds of complexities. So the approval voting does take up less space as far as on a ballot versus all of these choices. All the candidates are listed, but the approval version is less complex in that way.
Okay, next question.
We actually are out of time for questions.
Okay.
But we would like to give a round of applause for our panelists.